Good morning or afternoon, everybody. This is the Accelatis Essentials course. Today's class is going to be on the Accelatis services and how they communicate with the database and how they communicate with each other. This is a very light subject, so I am stretching to get some content in here, so hopefully we can fill up 15 minutes for you. The Essentials class is a 15-minute long session. We focus on specific subjects, so we're not going to do a Q&A afterwards. We're just going to try to keep it down to a reasonable time so everybody can get along with their day. So quick list of the services and processes that we currently have here at Accelatis. On a Windows server, you might see any of the following. We have the Accelatis agent host, the Accelatis agent JWS, the Accelatis unified activity filter, or it's possible that you might have the Accelatis client agent host, which is part of that load site that you may or may not be using. And over on the Unix side of the house, which could be either a Linux, Solaris, or AIX box, we have the ACC Unix agent. We also have a JWS flavor that would run on your Unix box. Or you might have something called activity tracking, which is the Unix equivalent of the Accelatis unified activity filter that normally runs on Windows. And then on the client side, there's a couple of things that you might see. The Accelatis Center of Excellence, which is the UI that everybody does their work in as far as seeing dashboards and health checks and creating automations and all that fun stuff. And then there's also something called the dashboard widget. So I'm going to cover all of those individually. So again, that first service, the Windows Agent Host, if you were to look at a task manager, and if it's running as a service, you'll see a process called ACC Windows Service Host.exe. You could actually run that agent host in the foreground. There is an executable called ACC Service Host.exe, so it's very similar. But in this way, you don't necessarily have to start it as a service. You can launch it in the foreground, which sometimes for troubleshooting, that might help you understand what's going on. You can also test to see if the service starts as a particular user. Maybe you want to start it as a different user other than local system to see if there might be some rights issues or something going on. So again, you can launch it in the foreground. And the Accelatis agent host carries out most of the Accelatis functionality, and you can see the list there: KPI collection, health checks, SLA computation, automation. So any of these things that you normally might associate Accelatis with, the Accelatis agent host is probably doing that sort of work. And it's important to note too that the agent host is what's doing all of the database interactions, such as getting records or purging or archiving. Anything that touches the database is going to go through the Accelatis agent host. The next one is the Accelatis agent JWS. If you were to look at it in the processes field, it runs as a process called tomcat6_64.exe as a service. And again, you have that option to launch it in the foreground. If you did so, it would look like java.exe. And it carries out the S-base client functionality. So JWS will actually go in and get things like the log files. It will go ahead and issue the health checks, KPIs, and automation tasks like load data, clear zero. So really, if you think about the JWS process, it is really the S-base client, right? So anything that we need to do in S-base, that actually goes through that JWS process, whether it's a service or running in the foreground. The Accelatis Unified Activity Filter, it runs as ACC unifilter.exe. It is normally started as a service, and it's there really. It reads network traffic and identifies specific port and context conversations. So in other words, this is the process that's going to go and read your user activity. So if somebody goes into workspace, somebody grabs a form from somewhere, the unified activity filter is the service that's going to go and make some sense of that. It's going to read it off of the network card, understand that, oh, this is so-and-so, and they're connecting to the server. They're doing this at this time. It took 20 seconds, whatever. This is the process that figures all that stuff out. And then you've got something called the Accelatis Client Agent Host, which I don't see out there most of the time, but this is actually the load site. When you see the Accelatis runtime directory, and you've got a directory called load site. This is the process that runs as a service, ACC client service.exe, or you can run it in the foreground, ACC client agent console.exe. And again, this is the load site. So it carries out health checks every 10 minutes. It also executes packages for simulations or load packages. So if you're doing an automated simulation and you've got some load sites sprinkled around your your corporate offices, this is the process that's actually going to take those and run them. And I wanted to note that in the newer versions you'll be able to modify that 10-minute check time, but for right now just know that this particular service, you are tied to a 10-minute window. It's going to take 10 minutes and it's going to check to see if it has things to do. So you're sort of tied to that for now. And over on the Unix side of the house, we have the ACC Unix agent, and you're going to find that these Unix services all run as Java. So you'll see java.exe running, and if you're on the Unix side of the house, you'll know that you can just do a PSEF and grep for certain directories to know what it is, right? So they're all going to look like java.exe running. The ACC Unix agent, much like the Windows counterpart, will carry out activities such as KPI collection for the OS, health checks, log retrievals for the OS, automations, and alerting. This all comes from this service. The thing to note here is that the Unix agent cannot accept client connections. So if you're on the UI and you try to point it to a Unix agent, it's just going to fail. It cannot do that yet. Unix also has activity tracking, which is really the unified activity filter counterpart, right? So it runs as java.exe like most of our Unix services does. It needs root access for an interface connection. And same thing, it's just going to read the network traffic. Same idea, it's going to understand, oh, this person wants to see planning smart view traffic, right? So it figures out what's going on. Now, unlike the Windows unifilter, the activity tracking that runs on Unix writes to the database directly. Again, the Windows one does not do that, but just note that the Unix one does do that. It will write to the database, so anything that it sees is interesting traffic and it understands what you're looking for, it will plop that right into the database directly. And then JWS 6, again, same thing on Windows or Unix. It's actually the same set of binaries with the exception of this one runs as java.exe as opposed to that Tomcat one on Windows. Same functionality, and again, you got to think of JWS 6 as the client interface to Essbase for all of your applications. And then that takes us to the client side of the house. We have the Center of Excellence, which runs as deploymentmanager.exe. It'll connect to a single server, so when you log on, you click a preferred server, and it will connect to that server for most things. It's going to go ahead and cache certain data on startup. So sometimes if agents are down and you bring the deployment manager up, you may find that you need to restart deployment manager after the agent is restarted in order to get that data to show up correctly. Database retrieval through that UI is done through the preferred server to which it's connected. So in other words, when you're sitting there with the Accelatis UI in front of you and you're gathering data and pulling logs and getting all this stuff, you're not actually connecting to the database. You're connecting to the server, which is connecting to the database. So that's important to know. The Environment Manager page is a standout as far as the Center of Excellence goes because that actually does go out and talk to each and every server. So if you are sitting on a client terminal and you've got the UI open and you open up the Environment Manager, the expectation is that you are going to have connections to the host port, which is 8732, on all of your servers because it's going to go out and query all of them. Hey, are you running? Are you running? And that's how it builds that page where you get that nice visual look at what's going on. And also, when you start tabbing over to services and processes in Environment Manager, again, it's a direct connection to the server, so it's important to understand that even though the client connects to one preferred server for most things, that Environment Manager page is definitely different. And then we've also got a dashboard widget that runs as ACC dashboard widget.exe on the client, and it connects to a server for dashboard retrieval. It can be modified via options, so you can get any number of dashboards or server connections to it. And again, if you're not using that, you can find that little file in the client directory, and it really is a nice solution to somebody who's just looking for a certain set of data running in their Accelatis environment. So, like I said, for the client communication, you're not actually talking to the database. You are talking to an Accelatis host, which is talking to the database. So that is true with the desktop widget. That is true with the Center of Excellence. That is also true with the load site, which runs as agent client host. It talks to the host, and for the most part, the host is the thing that's doing all of the database communications. Now, when a host initializes, you can see it starts up. The first thing it does is it secures a database connection, and that's how it gets a lot of its properties and things that it needs to initialize. It'll also go out and it'll try to get all of the plugin data. And I specifically put including JWS there because it's important to note that JWS is unlike any other plugin that we use. JWS the startup and shutdown is not dictated by the Accelatis host. So we need to make sure that JWS is up so that when the host goes through this initialization process and it gets to JWS, that it can go out there and it can get all the properties that it needs in order to initialize successfully. So again, important to note that if anything is down, JWS or planning, and the host starts up and it fails that initialization, it won't keep retrying the initialization. You've got to go and you've got to shut the host down, get all these other things up first, and then restart it. And in your Accelatis environment, important to note that all of the servers that you have communicate with the database, but they do not communicate with each other. So the first server in this picture to the left, if it needs to get some jobs completed on the server all the way to the right, they actually don't talk to each other. The server will write to the database and say, hey, I need this server, all the way to the left to do something. And then eventually, every couple of seconds, every server checks the database to see if they have any jobs to do. And again, this database acts as a hub for all of the communication between the hosts. So important to note that only agents communicate with the database. They do not communicate with each other. They are all independent. Which brings me to our service dependency. So when you're thinking about the environment and services coming up and what needs to come up first, we need your basic Oracle services up first, which would be your database, right? So Oracle SQL Server needs to be up and running and available. The next thing up is your EPM suite. So whatever you have on the server is running, Workspace, RA Framework, Planning, Essbase, whatever it is, and any applications that do not auto start. So in other words, if you have HFM and you connect to an application that's not running, HFM will just start up the application, so that's no big deal. But over on the Essbase side, if your app is not set up to start up correctly and we try to connect to it, we're not going to be able to connect to it. So important to note that we need the products, we need the applications that you want to monitor up, so that way we can connect to them successfully. Next thing up would be Accelatis JWS needs to be the second thing to initialize, and it does take a minute to initialize, so make sure if you write it into scripts for your EPM startup that you give it enough time to fully pull in all of the properties that it's looking for, make all the connections that it needs, so that way when the third step of bringing up the Accelatis host services happen, when it reaches that point in the cycle, it can get the information, right? So for both Windows and Unix, the third thing would be the Accelatis host services. The next thing in line would be your activity filter or your activity tracking if you're on Unix. So the Windows Unified Activity Filter will expect a host agent in order to connect, and you'll see an error message in the Windows log if that doesn't happen. And even though it'll be up and it'll be running, it actually won't write anything to the database. So if you were just to bring up Unifilter on a Windows box and start plugging away at your EPM system, you're not going to see anything in the database as far as user activity. So it really expects and needs that agent host to be up. Unix is a little bit different. If you were to fire up your activity tracking on Unix, it actually will start writing to the database. It has no dependency on an agent, but for best practice, we would just put these two together and say that these are the third thing in the order that you need to start it up. And of course, the last thing up is going to be your center of excellence. So your client, only after everything is initialized successfully, you want to bring the center of excellence up, and then you'll be able to see all the information in there that you need. The desktop widget is also going to expect a host connection, so you will predefine where you want it to connect. Obviously, that needs to be up first. And the load site, same thing. We'll expect to get a connection to a host, so that's in this last group of Accelatis services that would need to be started. So all that being said, that's all of our services and processes that we run. Next session that we're going to do is change audit tracking. We're going to show you how to configure it and schedule it. and how to read and report on the data. So if that's of interest of you, join us next week and we'll do the same class. We are always looking for your feedback. Let us know if there's anything you want to see in this presentation, any subjects. You can email me, email the support general mailbox. And thanks so much, everybody, for attending, and have a great day.